good to be with you for this small group session. And we're coming down to the end of this journey in the Gospel of John. I want to invite you to turn to the 17th chapter. 17th chapter is a prayer that Jesus prays. It's called the high priestly prayer that Jesus prays for his disciples. In some ways, it serves not just as a form of intercession by Jesus for his disciples, but it also serves in some ways as a summary of the entire message of John's Gospel. I want to begin with you at the 9th verse of this prayer. Jesus prays this: I'm praying for them. I'm not praying for the world, but for those you gave me, because they are yours. Everything that is mine is yours, and everything that is yours is mine. I have been glorified in them. I'm no longer in the world, but they are in the world, even as I'm coming to you. Holy Father, watch over them in your name, the name you gave me, that they will be one, just as we are one. When I was with them, I watched over them in your name, the name you gave me, and I kept them safe. None of them were lost except the one who was destined for destruction, so that Scripture would be fulfilled. Now I'm coming to you, and I say these things while I'm in the world, so that they can share completely in my joy. I gave your word to them, and the world hated them, because they don't belong to this world, just as I don't belong to this world. I'm not asking that you take them out of this world, but that you keep them safe from the evil one. They don't belong to this world, just as I don't belong to this world. Make them holy in the truth. Your word is truth. As you sent me into the world, so I have sent them into the world. I make myself holy on their behalf, so that they also would be made holy in the truth. I love this prayer, especially verses 15 and 16 and 17 again. I'm not asking that you take them out of the world, but that you keep them safe from the evil one. They don't belong to this world, just as I don't belong to this world. Make them holy in your truth. Your word is truth. I get together about 4 or 5 times a year with a group of leaders. It's a group of Jewish rabbis and leaders of the Jewish community, Catholic leaders, and also Protestant leaders. We get together and discuss a different topic every time we get together, and we'll have lunch together. And a number of years ago now, we got together one time and we were talking about, we decided to talk about Hollywood and media and the influence of the media. And the Jewish leaders were in charge that day. And so in the midst of our conversations, one of the rabbis told a joke. It's one of my favorite jokes, although oftentimes people don't laugh, even though I still think it's funny. But the rabbi said, about 80 years ago, a group of Jewish leaders got together, and they were very concerned about the ways that different aspects of the culture were going. They were concerned about Wall Street and the financial world, the markets of the world. They were concerned about politics and the direction that politics were going. And there was this new thing called Hollywood and the development of television and film, and they were concerned about the direction that was going. So they met together for several weeks and prayed about what God would have them do. And at the end of their time together, a third of them ran for office and moved to Washington, D.C. A third of them went to New York and started working on Wall Street, and a third moved to Los Angeles and started working in Hollywood. And the joke says about 60 years later, so about 10, 15, 20 years ago, a group of evangelical Christians got together, and they were very concerned about the direction that Wall Street was going, very concerned about the direction politics was going, very concerned about the direction that Hollywood was going and moving culture. And so they met together also for several weeks and prayed together. And at the end of their prayer time together, they all moved to Colorado Springs. Now, Jason is laughing at that, and you may laugh at that. You may not laugh at that. But the point of the joke for the rabbi was that the Jewish leaders kind of got involved in those different areas, whereas evangelicals have had a tendency to create organizations and move to places like Colorado Springs or other places where a lot of Christian organizations are. And rather than seemingly get involved in those areas, kind of yell at those areas or protest those areas. It's kind of an interesting joke. But it points to some of the tension that I think we find in this text. It's the question of, Jesus says, I'm sending my disciples into the world. And by that, he doesn't mean necessarily the world meaning the globe. One of the ways we can, I think, misread this text is to somehow see Jesus thinking of us and of himself as somehow part of some alien culture somewhere. We just happen to visit Earth, and so we're not really of the earth, for we are of the earth. You read Genesis, we were created from the dust of the earth. This isn't as though we don't belong or are connected to the earth. But when Jesus talks about the world, he's talking about the principalities and powers, the structures, the cultures, the ways in which things have been formed. But we're not of that. We're of a different kingdom, if you will, a different structure, a different politic, a different way. And Jesus has introduced his disciples to that and initiated them into that. They, in a sense, have been baptized into this kingdom that is led by him and is the kingdom of the Father. And yet we're still a part of these systems and structures. We're still a part of the world. So this truly is a prayer for Jesus, that his disciples would be in the world, but not be of the world, that they would not be shaped by the evil one. Most of you have probably heard me tell the story about meeting my favorite Old Testament scholar years ago, Walter Brueggemann, and asking him, what did he get? How has he been able to write so many books? And he said to me, there's just one story in the scripture. It just gets repeated over and over. And that story is this, that God has called the people to be his unique people in the world, whether that's Israel or the church, to be salt and light, to be instruments of his way of being in the world. But here's the problem. They always live in what Brueggemann calls an empire. They always live in a system, a structure, and they're to live in that without being of that. And so how do we do that? I mean, that's a really, really tricky thing. The prayer Jesus prays is that we would learn to live in the world but not be of it. But he says this, Father, sanctify them in the truth, or sanctify them in the word. I have taught them the word. So sanctify, keep them holy in the word. I think a lot about what does that look like for us? What does that look like for us? I love driving past and seeing some of the Orthodox Jewish communities in Los Angeles, especially down in the Hollywood and Beverly Hills area. There's a number of synagogues and Orthodox folks on a Friday evening or Saturday that you'll see walking to temple with their beards and the hats and the long coats. And every time I see them, I think that's so interesting to try in this secular society to keep that unique way of life alive. The problem for those of us who are evangelical Christians may be that we don't have long beards and curls and we don't have black coats. Some of the strength of evangelical Christianity is we blend in, but maybe some of that is the weakness, that we blend in. And so we have to ask the questions. We don't have curls and coats and hats, but what is our uniqueness then? How do we live in the world but not be of it? How do we be sanctified in the truth? Certainly, one of the ways we do that is we stay connected to the Word. And it's one of the reasons why I hope for my own kids, but for the students that I work with and for you, that you become really good students of the Word and that you're in it daily, that it becomes the way that you soak in the language and the perspective of God, so that you walk through life, interpreting your life through the Scripture. But when Jesus prayed that for the disciples, and when the early church that John is writing to and is giving this prayer to, when they gathered together, they had no concept of having a Bible that they could take home with them and study personally. And so they had to keep meeting together. They had to keep coming together and hearing that letter that John had given to them read aloud. But they had to connect together and pray together and think together about what that looks like. And so in some ways, what you're doing tonight in gathering with other Christians and saying, pray for me, talk to me, how do I go do my job tomorrow? And how do we raise kids in this culture and not just go live in a commune, but how do we help them to not only live in it, but to be agents of transformation in it? Practices of prayer, practices of community, practices of conversation, practices of being inscribed in the Word. All of those kinds of things fit together. I'm a fan of John Wesley, as you probably know, and John Wesley would say all of us kind of need at least 3 different maybe 4 different groups in our lives. We certainly need the 3 in terms of we need to constantly and regularly gather for worship so that we know we're part of a people, a movement, and we celebrate that. And we know that God is our audience and that Christ is Lord, and we're part of that. But then we also need to be part of kind of medium-sized groups, like for us, like a Sunday school class where you gather together and say, help me, now that we've thought and talked about the word, how do we put that into daily life? But we even need smaller groups, sort of like what you're part of now, where we say to each other, I need to be accountable. Hold me accountable. Let me confess my sins. Let me confess my struggles. Let me talk about my doubts. Let's share that together so we can pray and encourage and hold each other accountable. And I would add one more to that. We probably need our private time where we are studying the word and praying. And all of that is necessary because this is hard and this is not easy. This is the stuff Jesus prays over. I'm sending them into the world. I don't want you to take them out of the world, but I don't want them to become part of the world. I think about that with my kids. So our 2 oldest sons are in college and both love God and are committed to Christ, but it's interesting the directions they feel like they want to go in their life. Caleb is studying film and television. He's also a biblical studies major. But he's wrestling with, what does that look like to head into that kind of industry that is so of the world, but for him to enter into that as salt and light, what does that look like? I pray for him because I want him to be part of that world, but not be of that world. That's not easy. Noah's studying music. He's been writing songs all semester. He wrote a song for his mother, which was beautiful and jumped him to the first place on the list of favorite kids by a long shot for her. But he's thinking about the possibility of maybe going into the music industry. I can't think of an industry that is more shaped by the world maybe than the music industry. And so I pray for him. What does that mean? I don't want to take him out of the world, but how does he live in that world but not be of it? These are hard conversations. And it takes practice, and it takes work, and it takes prayer, and it takes God's protection, and it takes us holding each other accountable. And so I'd love for you to talk about that tonight. Maybe the strength of evangelical Christians like us is that we blend into the world pretty easily. No beards, no curls, no black coats. But maybe that's the weakness of our forms of Christianity also, is we blend into the world. And so how do we live in the world but not be of it? Jesus certainly is praying for us, that we would figure that out. But I'd love for you to ask this question. What are the practices? What are the things that we have to do that are necessary for us to figure out how to do this very challenging thing, to be salt and light in the world without, in a sense, being, as Paul would say, not being conformed into its image? So I'd love for you to ask that question tonight. What are the practices necessary, not just for us, but for our children? In a couple of weeks, we'll enter into the Advent season, and I'm going to talk about exile. And the primary form of exile for the Israelites was the time when they found themselves in Babylon. And Babylon, of all of the times Israel found itself in captivity, Babylon was the trickiest. And the reason was because Babylon was so, forgive the term, but Babylon was so seductive. Babylon liked them. They wanted the Judeans to be leaders. Nebuchadnezzar wanted them to be leaders. He wanted them to be good Babylonians. And the struggle, the fear was that someday when God brought his kingdom, when God would redeem them and let them go home, their greatest fear was that their kids would stay there. That somehow in the midst of this challenge of living there and working for the good of Babylon, that somehow their children in the midst of that would become Babylonians. I think about that. How do we live in America and want our kids to be transformative in this culture without them becoming Americans first and Christians second? How do we help them stay Christian first and learn to be part of this world without becoming of it? Hard questions, so much so that Jesus prays for us, that we would learn that life. But I would love for you to talk about how do we learn that life and what practices are necessary for us to keep this unique way of life, the way of the kingdom, the way of Christ alive in this world. I'll be praying for you as you pray for each other. Lord bless you.